this is our January. I keep wanting to say February. I feel like January is taking a really long time. But we're not quite to the end yet. But this is our January Coffee Connect, putting the B in SEBL. So today we're really going to just focus on behavior. My name is Sarah Gentry. I am the Region 5 Social Emotional Behavioral Learning Specialist. That means I cover ESUs 13, 15, and 16, and my other colleagues are on the screen, so I will let them introduce themselves. Mackenzie, I'll let you start.
Hey everyone, I am the Region 1 SEBL Specialist, so that serves Region 4, 5, and 6, and also LPS, and I'll pass to Jill.
Perfect. Thanks, Mackenzie. I'm Jill Gunther, one of the other SEBL specialists. Currently, I'm serving Region 2 and 3. So Region 2 is ESUs 2, 3, and then OPS. And then Region 3, ESUs 1, 7, and 8.
Good morning. I'm Chandra Essex. I'm the SEBL specialist for Region 4. I work with ESUs 9, 10, 11, and 17.
Thanks, guys. Just a reminder, Mackenzie went ahead and dropped a PDF of the slides into the chat box. So if you guys are wanting to pull these up and reference them later, the access is in the chat. We're going to go ahead and kick this off with our New Year's Welcome Inclusion activity. I'm sure lots of you guys have already set your intentions or your goals or your whatever you want to call them for the new year, but we wanted to just take a moment and think and reflect a little bit about maybe 3 things you're excited about or 3 things you want to improve on this year, 3 accomplishments you've made in the past year. If you're at your desk and you want to take the time to write that down, you can do that. Or if you just want to kind of spend some time in reflection, we're going to give you a little bit of time to do that. If there's anyone on screen that wants to unmute or maybe share something that they're thinking about, feel free to do that. I think my biggest thing I want to improve on this year is maybe time management. I transitioned into work from home last year and I'm still trying to learn and navigate that world. So that would be my biggest thing. I don't know if I can come up with 3 off the bat. Okay, it's quiet in the Zoom today. So we get all of our resources, just a resource for you guys. We have it linked on that slide. The first 5 is an area where you can go to get those welcome inclusion activities. Also, we take all of the resources that we put into our Coffee Connect. So any of the resources we share today have been uploaded into our Padlet. The link is on the PDF of the slides. That password is NeMTSS. But if you see something in here that you really love, you can go back to the Padlet and access that resource. So then thinking about, we always start off with what is social emotional behavioral learning, SEBL. And for us at NeMTSS, we really like to emphasize that this is a system that is put in place to foster those social emotional skills, to make sure that we're teaching them, explicitly. We're making sure that it's happening all day, every day. We want to make sure that our system is set up to support adults and our students to kind of create that safe and supportive environment. We're hoping to increase those positive behavior and mental health outcomes for everyone. On the side of the slide, you can see Randolph Elementary. They have their school-wide expectations. We like to put an example of Nebraska schools, what they're doing. That's part of them building their system to support social emotional learning. We've got the mental health outcome, mental wellness icon on there to kind of remind us that social emotional behavioral learning skills really support those mental health outcomes. They also support career readiness standards and those things we're looking for our students to have as they go into the workforce. And then that last one is our Skills Star. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides, but that's the NeMTSS skills that we're really emphasizing that we're trying to teach our students. On this next slide, we talk about oh, that was kind of weird how it uploaded. We talk about how we align all the different models that go into place. So we're trying to develop one system, bring all of these different things into one framework, one system through MTSS. So our pyramid model is that framework that really emphasizes on early childhood social emotional. PBIS is that evidence-based tiered framework. So that's really represented in our layered continuum of support. At NeMTSS, and then comprehensive school mental health, that's that system of supports to help support our overall mental wellness of our students. And then recently we've added restorative practices. This is kind of an emerging social science to strengthen relationships in schools. And we've been working really hard to bring restorative practices into multiple districts throughout our state. So just another one of those things that you're hearing, but really what we like to do is align all of those initiatives because they really come together to support the overall social emotional learning of our students. Our next slide is our Skills Star. We've worked really hard on this. I think we probably rolled it out almost a year ago now, which seems unreal to me. But these are the 5 areas of social emotional wellness or social emotional skills that we really try to emphasize in teaching. So it's kind of broken down into different skills. So when we look at self-management, we're thinking about teaching our students to reflect on how they can be their best self. So some of those skills that we might teach to help our students do that are self-regulation, setting goals for themselves, self-discipline, teaching those things in the classroom, making sure that if our students are maybe deficient in that area or struggling in that area, that we're maybe providing some additional support to teach them those skills. But this list is really, something that we build on. Each of those skills, there's additional skills that go into teaching those. So it can be expanded on, and we have graphics to show that. But really, we like to put this in front of teachers and administrators to show, number one, social emotional learning is happening in your classroom already. I can think of multiple examples where I walk into a classroom and I see a teacher teaching by modeling compassion or inclusion. Those things are already really happening, so that maybe that when we're talking about social emotional learning, it doesn't feel like it's something separate from teaching academics. This is very much embedded into all of the things that we're doing every day. And then we like to kind of kick things off with a quote. This is a quote from NeMTSS because it's something that we really really believe. So that's who we paid honor to. But we do not want behavior and social emotional learning to operate in silos. We know that one supports the other. So really today, that's what we're going to be talking about. This is kind of setting the stage for how we believe that we align those two things. Moving into our next slide, we're going to just start jumping into what is behavior. The principles of behavior that we're thinking about. So behavior is something that is learned. A student who exhibits a behavior, it's because at some point in their life that behavior's worked for them. So it's something that they've learned. They have a reason for it. So it's not something that's just happening out of the blue. So there's a function to this. You probably have heard the quote, behavior is communication. Our students are using their behaviors really to communicate an unmet need most of the time, or something that they're seeking. I'm not going to read through all of these, but there's multiple different functions. So it's something that's effective. So they're getting what they need. So they are going to repeat that again. It's something that they've learned. And when it no longer serves its purpose, it's going to go away. So those are just kind of the principles of behavior that we'll talk more about as we go through the presentation. The next slide is kind of we talk about the system and really want to make sure that we're honing in on working with students in behavior and setting the stage for the desired behaviors that we want. This is a systemic process. We can't just wing it. It doesn't work. So what we do know is that our general ed and our special education, our tier 1 core, behaviors that we want to see need to be taught all the time to all of our students at that tier 1. So we're monitoring and thinking about those in our school-wide assessments, monitoring our data, setting up those prevention systems. So maybe that's a social emotional curriculum, you know, mentoring programs that are school-wide, so different things that schools are doing. The restorative practices, that foundational piece, is a school-wide prevention. So really thinking about setting the stage at tier 1 to model and teach those desired behaviors, the things that we want to see. Now, as you go down this, and I don't want to go too far into this, but once we see a student is struggling in some type of a behavior, we're going to want to jump in and see if maybe that's a relational thing. Start with check in, check out. That's a low-hanging fruit, easy thing to do. Implementing that evidence-based intervention is sometimes just what the kids need. And then if that's not working, that's when we jump in and we start thinking about function-based thinking to make the next choice on what type of supports our student need. So we're going to really kind of focus today, the rest of our time, on that function-based thinking. Transitioning into that, function-based thinking kind of seems like it can be scary if you're not trained in behavior and those kinds of things, but we really want to make it seem like it's very simple. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. So I hope everybody sings that song all day long now. But function-based thinking, we're really thinking about looking at our data, collecting our data, our perceptual data, our data that's coming in, maybe in office referrals or disruptions in the classroom, whatever's happening there in terms of data. We want to look and collect. We want to collect that and we want to analyze it. So some observations are going to be needed. And then we're going to develop that ABC pathway. I'm going to talk more about that in the next slide. And then we're going to determine that function. And once we've determined the function, that's when we can really start thinking about, okay, this is what's happening. The ABC pathway. So what we're going to be thinking about, we see a behavior happening. So then we're kind of going to start reflecting. We're going to be thinking about what happened just before that behavior happened. So that's our antecedents. Antecedents can be worded differently. It can be, you hear the term trigger. We're transitioning our language a little bit to use the term activator. Triggers kind of sometimes a trigger word for students. So we're thinking of, kind of that language shift, but antecedent. So what happened immediately before the behavior? And an antecedent can be one of two things. It can be, we might see a behavior that we've never seen that was like a desired behavior for our student. And we want to look back and say, okay, what caused that student to behave that way? What was the antecedent? What happened right before? And then even for those behaviors that are undesirable that we're looking at, what happened right before? So thinking about the antecedent. And then we're going to, once we know what that antecedent is, we're kind of thinking about what is the consequence? What can we do? How can we set the stage to A, see that desired behavior maybe that we've seen again, or B, set the stage to create the desired behavior where it's not happening. So reflecting on the antecedents. And then we're jumping into some of those. We're talking a lot about antecedents, so I want to talk about some of the things that could be. Sometimes the antecedent is that it's a non-preferred task. It's not exactly what our student was wanting to do in that moment, so that's a challenge. That's just part of a developmental thing with kids. It's just a challenge. Perception of difficult or laborious tasks. Maybe it seems like it's too hard. It's daunting. Lack of adult attention, or maybe the attention has been shifted somewhere else. Maybe we're seeing they're getting peer attention or reinforcement from their peers that maybe is leading to an undesired behavior or a desired behavior. Again, when we're thinking about behavior, sometimes we're wanting to look at those desired behaviors and how do we increase the frequency of those. So this is just a list of possible antecedents or activators for our students for you to kind of reflect on. And then when we're thinking about behavior, this is the other component that's so important. When we're thinking about the function of behavior, we have to make sure that we know what a behavior is. So a behavior is something that's measurable. So we see it, we can measure it by its frequency, we can measure intensity of this. So it's something that we can measure. It's also something that we can see or feel, or it's observable. And then it's also an objective thing. So when we're thinking about behaviors, we have to remember behavior is not a mental state. We can't define a behavior by it being a mental state. We can't call it a revenge. So a lot of times those are some of the things that maybe when we're feeling very personally attacked by a behavior, those are some of those things that we might hear, but those are not what it is. A behavior actually has to be something that's measurable, observable, and objective. And as we're going through and we're thinking about our functions and we're trying to work through this ABC pathway, we're going to try to develop our hypothesis statement. So our teams are going to come together and try to kind of summarize that challenging behavior. What does it mean? So that's when we start thinking about developing the when. So our when is our antecedent. So maybe it's when presented with something that Jimmy doesn't want to do, then what happens? The description of the behavior, Jimmy gets out of his seat and he roams around the room. So maybe it's we start our math assignment and Jimmy doesn't like math. He gets up and starts walking around. We're gonna probably define that as an escape avoid of a task that he doesn't want to do, but our consequence to that behavior might be in order to get Jimmy to sit in his seat. Maybe the teacher goes and stands by his desk, so she uses placement or something like that. So that could be the consequence to that. Just next slide is just another kind of example of how to develop that hypothesis statement. So again, when something happens in this example, when the student's asked to sit with peers during morning circle, the student pokes the student sitting next to him with his finger, and that consequence could be that the teacher sits next to the student, rubs his back. So we're thinking about the different behavior. The function could be that he's trying to obtain adult attention. Oh, okay. Those are all gonna, my examples are all gonna pop in there. So then thinking about our next slide, sometimes these kiddos, and this is, we're talking about maybe one behavior, our students might be experiencing more than one behavior at a time. It gets kind of overwhelming, trying to identify which behavior. You don't want to write a hypothesis statement for 7 or 8 different behaviors. So identifying that keystone behavior. The keystone behavior is that one behavior that maybe spreads and creates an additional, so maybe it has that snowball effect on different behaviors. So thinking about what's that like foundational behavior, or what is that one thing that creates the environment that causes multiple behaviors, so that domino effect or snowball effect. So identifying that behavior is really where you're going to want to start when you're thinking about the function of behavior.
All right, so we're going to dive a little bit more into function. But if you think back on that like flow chart that Sarah went through, you'll notice that function of behavior or thinking about function kind of comes into play after that check in, check out standard protocol, easy first line of response, tier 2 intervention. But that doesn't mean we can't think functionally across the board. So I'm not saying we need to make behavior plans or FBAs, function behavior assessments for every single student, but I think of it more as like a sprinkle magic dust, that you're kind of like sprinkling it over your staff and giving them this knowledge so they're able to think functionally on the spot and just have a little bit more of an informed decision when they're thinking about behaviors that they might see in their classroom here, like lower level behaviors. And when we're thinking about those social emotional skills, we're really thinking about how can we kind of plant those seeds through those conversations and through the way that we're responding to behaviors or trying to prevent behaviors, so we can grow those skills throughout. So it's really like that systematic process not happening in silos. So we're going to dive into these 2 main functions. We really simplify it. There's a couple different like approaches to how we're thinking about function. And so we're splitting it up into obtain and escape and avoid as being those 2 main functions. And these are basically like the payoff of like what is the person getting out of the behavior that they're displaying. So we'll dive a little bit deeper. We break these 2 down into 3 categories. So we have tangibles, attention, and sensory. And we're just going to dive into each one of those. So that first section is tangibles. And when we're thinking about tangibles, you might think about like physical items. So maybe they want like an iPad, or maybe they want like a certain object. Then you think of places. So this might be a desired room, or somewhere they enjoy going or don't enjoy going. And then tasks, so things like academic works, or when you're asking them to complete something. So as we go through these slides, they're kind of organized similarly, where we're first talking about antecedent intervention ideas, and then we're talking a little bit about maintaining consequences and how you can problem solve around that. So antecedent interventions, these are those things that are really prevention based. So when we think of that antecedent behavior consequence, we're thinking kind of like in a chain, like Sarah mentioned, you have the antecedent, you have the behavior, you have the consequence. And if you think of it in a chain, the goal here is how can you break the chain to stop the behavior? And when we're thinking about antecedent interventions, you're thinking, how can I do it earliest on? And so that behavior maybe doesn't even occur in the first place. So this is where you think about your antecedent interventions, prevention-based. Think, how can we prevent the behavior from occurring or lessen the chance of it occurring altogether? So when we think of that for a tangible item, you might think of front loading that desired item before a certain task. So maybe you're scheduling time for that preferred item. You're pairing yourself with that item so they know, like, if they engage in whatever with you, they will get the thing. Allowing choices. So maybe you're giving them different options so they feel like they can pick things that they desire more. Using a first then schedule, building persistence through encouragement before accessing the thing, systematically teaching weight. This isn't an all end all be all list, just some ideas of what you can maybe do before. And it all really depends on that function of what that person is wanting to get out of the behavior. So then when we have places or tasks, how could you front load to try to prevent that? So if it's a place, you can really provide that rich, predictable environment that might be more desirable to them, or you can give them the opportunity to access that place in a more scheduled, anticipated way. And so you could pre-teach information of that activity or routine of what it looks like in that place. You can provide really that predictable schedule or environment, provide more frequent breaks or scheduled breaks, provide transition cues. So what does that look like to from A to B? What is this looking like? Kind of giving them that heads up within the routine. Enriching the environment. If there's some sensory stuff going on within a certain place, maybe you take some of those desirable things and put them in the place you want the student to be. And then we have tasks. So thinking about desired tasks, if they're trying to avoid a task, you may be allowing them choice, chunking assignments, incorporating their interests. So if they really like superheroes, how can you incorporate that into the task that you're doing within your academic setting? Adopting or modifying instruction as appropriate, promoting that active engagement. So there's just a lot of different things, and really it does depend on the certain situation. Every situation is a little different. And then behavior momentum, that's just a fancy way of saying do the easy things first before the harder things. So maybe you have a student do something easy like passing out the papers or doing something they'll see success, and then you praise that success, and then you give them something that might be a little more challenging, and hopefully they'll be more likely to comply. So now we're going to talk about maintaining consequences. So the consequence is the thing that happens directly after the behavior. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a positive thing. There's kind of that misnomer of what consequence means. But maintaining consequences are those things that are reinforcing the behavior. So they're like making the behavior continue to happen. They're increasing the likelihood that it'll happen again in the future. So when we split out between those two functions, obtain and escape and avoid, if we have tangibles, if they're trying to obtain something, that would mean they're trying to access that preferred place or those preferred items. And so you would want to attempt to increase that reinforcement of them being able to obtain those things, but in a more appropriate way. And then when they're wanting to access preferred tasks, sometimes even doing nothing is more preferable. And so thinking about how can you give them a little bit of what they want, but also in a more appropriate way. So it all comes down to, like, we can't go from like these undesirable behaviors to the perfect, what we want to see for every single student. So we have to think about those replacement behaviors. So how can we get the student to do something that is more desirable for us? Maybe not like top tier, what we're expecting every single student to do, but how can we do something that's better than what they're already doing and is a small step forward in the right direction? So we call those approximations of behavior, and we really have to compromise here. It's so easy to just want the best behaviors to happen, but we have to start small and work our way towards those desired behaviors. So when you're thinking about what can we do for consequences, we want to identify what is the current consequence, what is happening as a result of the behavior. Is it being reinforced, and how? Because sometimes we reinforce behaviors that we don't even realize. And then how can you teach, prompt, or introduce that more acceptable behavior? So now we're going to talk about attention. So you can either want to obtain or escape or avoid attention. And we kind of split this up into that peer attention and adult attention. It doesn't have to be separate. Sometimes it's both, but just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about behavior. So some antecedent intervention for behaviors. So again, antecedent intervention is really that front loading. How are we preventing or lowering the chances of that behavior occurring? So if the student or person is, you believe the function is attention, you might develop that solid positive relationship with the student, either through an intervention like check in, check out, or a 2x10 intervention, where you're really providing that attention, those conversations on more of a fixed schedule. You're allowing more opportunities to respond. You're increasing that positive praise. If it's peer attention, you might create more opportunities to interact with peers, providing more information from peers, so they can participate in activities or routines with that peer attention. And then non-contingent attention, that is just how are you providing the attention regardless of circumstance. So how much support are you offering during instruction? Maybe they have a student helper that you're providing no matter what that behavior is. You're just, you know that they're going to get it throughout. So those maintaining consequences for attention, again, these are the things that are keeping the behavior happening and occurring, and you're wanting to think what is happening, what is reinforcing the behavior, and how can I teach, prompt, or introduce that more acceptable behavior. So with adult attention, if they're wanting to obtain it, you really want to hone in on that connection. Manned compliance. So I want to shout out to Kara Cole. She's our ASD network coach in Region 1. We adapted some of these slides from the FBA day that I did with her. And manned compliance came up, and we're like, okay, what does this mean? Like, it's a really behavioral term. And manned compliance is just simply defined as a person's request. So think command or demand. So like a knock on the door is a request for the door to be opened. So you might think about manned compliance as the adult complying to a child's request, kind of those like simple things. So really giving them some of that attention, but more appropriately. Peer attention, obviously, they might be seeking out maybe even negative peer attention. So thinking about how can you make that a little bit more positive or more appropriate. And sometimes we see the behaviors to get attention, even though they're not ideal, they're getting what that function is obtaining the attention. And then escaping, avoiding attention. So this, again, is just trying to like get rid of the attention essentially. So how can we think functionally about lessening some of that attention that we're providing in hopes that that behavior wouldn't occur? And how can we, from that maintaining side, that consequence side, make it so they're doing it more appropriately? And then we have sensory. So you might avoid or try to obtain sensory stimulation. So thinking about those antecedent interventions. So front loading what happens directly before. You would want to consider any medical needs, enriching the environment with those sensory supports. For example, in the classroom, if a student, we see this a lot with like flexible seating. If they're really seeking some of that movement, you might provide a seat that allows more movement. And that would be a great example of an antecedent intervention, because you're hoping that if you provide this for the student to use, it will lessen the chance that they are trying to seek that in maybe through like finding somewhere else to sit or sitting inappropriately on different objects, things like that. You can try to incorporate those sensory activities into instructional tasks, reduce some of those aversive sensory experiences within the classroom. So you could provide a calm and quiet corner. You can provide more of a scheduled time for sensory needs, because you're trying to prevent or front load some of those needs before they happen. And then maintaining consequences. If they're trying to obtain that sensory stimulation, you would want to identify like, what are they trying? What is that sensory stimulation they're trying to obtain? And how can we reinforce something similar for them to attain in a more effective or appropriate way, and escaping, avoiding that. Why are they trying to, or what are they trying to escape or avoid within the environment? And is there a way we can reinforce them doing it more appropriately, or altogether remove that from the experience? So that was kind of deep into that behavior stuff. Again, this is kind of diving a little bit deeper into maybe more of those individualized needs, but that doesn't mean you can't think functionally across the board, across all three tiers. The one thing, the most important thing when it comes to behavior and to thinking about how we're responding to behavior is, what are we doing and is it matching the function? Because the most effective way to respond to behavior is when we're responding in a way that matches the function. So if the function is to obtain adult attention, if we are reinforcing the negative behavior by giving them the adult attention, it's only going to increase that negative behavior. And if we're able to provide support where they're obtaining adult attention, but more appropriately, or we're not reinforcing that negative behavior by giving them that attention, then we're going to see that change in behavior. But oftentimes we might see, like, this is a very simple example, the student's function might be attention, and we're offering them a break in class. So that isn't necessarily lined up. So while the practice might be okay, and maybe you might see a little bit of change, it's really not hitting that same function. And so the result of those behavior supports won't be as effective. All right, we're going to pass it on to Jill.
Perfect. Thanks, Mackenzie. All right, so we wanted to just talk a little bit about that kind of can't do versus won't do. And I don't love the the can't do, because obviously we always want to have like those high expectations and things like that, but really kind of changing our way of thinking, and really thinking about that can't do just being that skill deficit. So really thinking about those skills, and whether or not the student really has or is having those behaviors because of those skill deficits. So really thinking about, do they have that knowledge, that understanding of whatever the skill is within their skill repertoire? And if not, we really need to think about, how do we teach that skill? And then how do we reinforce that skill as well? And then the kind of won't do piece is more of that performance deficit. So really thinking about, the student doesn't have that right kind of motivating factor, or that context really kind of in place. And we need to really dig into, how are we motivating? And then really practicing when we're thinking about that performance piece. And so really kind of breaking down these next few pieces of really looking into, is it a skill deficit or is it a performance deficit when we're thinking about behavior? So here, really kind of thinking about that teaching for the skill deficit piece. So this kind of falls within that can't do. So do they have the skills necessary? Or are they showing those behaviors because they don't have those skills? And we really need to think about how we're teaching those skills, and then also that reinforcement. So really thinking about, only occurring when the student is regulated. So when we're thinking about teaching those skills, in terms of that skill deficit, obviously we don't want to be teaching those skills during dysregulation. So we want that student to be available for that learning when we're thinking about teaching that skill. That learning won't take place without that direct instruction. So really thinking about how we're digging into teaching that particular skill, and then having those repeated opportunities to practice that skill with that reinforcement involved as well. And then in the moment teaching, really kind of thinking about that piece as well. We really need to identify a time for instruction for that skill deficit piece. This next one, just kind of thinking about how motivation impacts student behavior. And when we say motivation is not internal, really kind of thinking about it in terms of that point that motivation is really driven by environmental factors over those like internal personal factors. And is influenced by the environment and affects that value of reinforcement. So always taking into account and really thinking about how that motivation can impact the behavior as well. Obviously, when we think about what we might be motivated by, the more available something is, the less you might want it. And then the less available it is, the more that we're going to want it. So really thinking about it kind of in terms of those two pieces as well. So more valuable for those bigger behaviors, less valuable for those smaller behaviors. So just kind of a nice breakdown in terms of motivation there. Then we kind of get into the performance deficit piece. So really thinking about motivating for that kind of won't do, and what that might look like. So really taking a look at our reinforcement. Is the reinforcement that we're providing to the student for that behavior, is it matching up with that function of behavior? So Mackenzie really dug into identifying some of those different functions of behavior. We really want to make sure that our reinforcement matches up with that function as well. And then also looking at the ratio of reinforcement. So if it's a new skill and the student is really working on engaging in that new skill, we really want to look at like 1-to-1, right? But really digging into what is our ratio for reinforcement as well. And then taking a look at other variables as well. So for the adult that's presenting the information, Is it maybe too fast? Is it too slow? So kind of digging into those pieces and then looking at the communication skills as well. So the communication, the way, the language that the adult is using, is it matching the student's understanding as well? Are maybe some visual supports, maybe a schedule, thinking about those pieces as well. Are those needed? And then maybe do we need a signal that a response is required? So maybe it's a nonverbal, maybe it's a verbal signal. So kind of digging into those pieces as well when we're thinking about those performance deficit. The other piece we wanted to just kind of share in thinking about behavior and really where that B falls into that social emotional learning, and kind of thinking about the reframing piece. So maybe this is kind of the quote that's happening, right? So he's so rude, he never respects me, wanders around the room during instructional time. And kind of moving it into a, hey, let's get curious rather than furious. We also have a presentation linked in from a colleague's good friend. She actually shared at the Nebraska NeMTSS Summit. She had several breakout sessions. One of them was around get curious, not furious, but really dug into some of those just reframing pieces. And we thought this really aligned nicely with some of the work that we're doing around restorative practices as well. So if we think about it in terms of, hey, let's get curious, what are some things that we might think of? What are some questions we might pose? So maybe it's something like, I wonder if something happened outside of school. Does whole group instruction maybe activate any behavioral response? And then that kind of reframing piece. So we have that first kind of quote in that green box there, but how might we reframe that in terms of let's get curious, let's ask some questions, let's kind of reframe our thinking in terms of this behavior. So maybe it's something like, hey, he's a highly active child. I can give him some movement opportunities before starting that whole group instruction, and then maybe some helping tasks throughout the lesson. So maybe it's an opportunity to kind of get up and move during the lesson. Maybe it's this student gets to pass out papers, or maybe it's a quick trip to the front office, or maybe it's a peer interaction, whatever that might be. But really thinking about it in terms of how might we kind of reframe our thinking when we're kind of analyzing those behaviors that are occurring. The other piece here, we really wanted to make that connection. We do a lot of work around affective language, affective statements with restorative practices. And this idea kind of comes from Allie Hearn here. We're thinking about behaviors, right? We have kind of two different pieces. So we have affective statements for addressing behaviors that are out of alignment with our values or our expectations. And then we have affective statements for addressing behaviors that are in alignment with our values or with our expectations. And so just kind of breaking down the one that digs into addressing behaviors that are out of alignment. Affective statements can kind of be broken down into these different pieces. And so we have those outlined in different colors within those boxes. So as we're thinking about our statement, we're going to clearly identify the who. So who we're talking to, right? The student's name. Then we have the identified value or the agreement that our class or our school has agreed upon. Then we have the specific behavior. So non-judgmental here, just identifying what that behavior is, just simply stated. Then we have the why, so the why it matters, and thinking about kind of breaking that down even further into the feeling and then the impact on others. So the impact on the community, the impact on the classroom, thinking about those, and then a do with moment. So with this do with moment, again, kind of some different choices kind of embedded within. So a do with moment could be, hey, let's do this together, right? How can I help? It could be a replacement behavior. So offering a different choice or maybe like a better choice, or a request. So a request to do something. So we have an example statement which just kind of utilizes each of those different pieces for addressing behaviors that are out of alignment with our values or our expectations. So here our example is, Heather, in our classroom, we value safety. When you're throwing pencils at the ceiling, you risk a pencil injuring you or your classmates. Please keep your pencil on your desk. Thank you. Okay, and we have it nicely broken down by and color coded to just kind of match each of those different pieces as well. We did want to point out when we're thinking about those affective statements, the kind of why it matters. Just kind of a disclaimer with that as well. We want to be very specific and we want to avoid that blame or that shame. So when talking about those values, those feelings, we also want to take into account our tone, right? Our tone of voice, and then the language that we're using. So what we say, how we say, it truly does matter. So really kind of remembering those two important pieces as well. And then for the I feel, so really kind of thinking about the emotion, the when is the trigger, the behavior, the because is the why or the need. But just kind of our, I guess, our warning or our statement of caution is when we don't feel like we can kind of state that impact on the feelings piece. So we don't want to place shame or blame by saying those feelings, like this makes me angry or this makes me upset. We can just really talk about it in terms of the impact on the community instead. And so just kind of thinking about that as we're kind of breaking down those pieces, just really thinking about that, that feeling piece especially. All right. And then, of course, a great reminder that when we're thinking about relationships, those positive relationships are, of course, at the very heart of managing any student behavior. So we want to ensure that we're taking the time. We are really practicing building those relationships. We want to practice those skills of active listening, kind of finding those common interests, and really thinking about how we can build those relationships student to adult. And always that reminder, I think Mackenzie mentioned it earlier as well, but not taking those behaviors personally and to heart. And so always thinking about digging into how can I build a relationship? How can I strengthen this relationship with this student as we're working to manage those behaviors? All right, a few additional resources for you guys as well. So on this slide, we have that first document there. It actually originally comes from the University of South Florida, I believe, but it's a functional behavioral assessment, behavior intervention plan, technical adequacy evaluation tool. Whew, that's a mouthful. So it is the Tate scoring guide, but just kind of an interesting document, a helpful document. It's a great resource to kind of take a look at, maybe come back and check out, maybe kind of put on your to-do list to come back and take a look at. But it has a variety of just different components identified. And then there's a rubric for whether that component is not addressed within the behavior plan, maybe it's partially addressed or it's completely addressed. So again, maybe something to take a look at with your team. The second document that we have on there comes from the tiered fidelity inventory. So it is actually page 31 from the TFI. And we wanted to, again, just really make that connection to some of those features within the tiered fidelity inventory, obviously to behavior. And so this is actually the scoring rubric for different behavior support plans, but another great resource as you're digging into some of those pieces. We talked a little bit about hypothesis statements. We talked a little bit about kind of digging into the function of behavior, but this is a great way to kind of analyze some of those different pieces of your behavior support plans and making those connections of the features of the TFI. Yes, and Mackenzie put just a little note for Mackenzie. Do you want to mention anything about that?
I mean, I think we kind of like bounce back and forth between those layers of support today. And so like those reframing and effective statements are really more kind of those tier 1 supports. And then these resources are really more of those tier 3 supports. Just pointing that out.
Yes, absolutely. Great point. Thanks for that reminder. Okay, and then before we end here, just a few additional opportunities. So this first one, we have a variety of different foundational restorative practices trainings coming up. We have one in February, which is in North Platte. So more information is linked on the slide here. And then we have a couple opportunities in a couple different places across the state. So we have one in Kearney and then one in La Vista. Those are happening in June. So again, all of the information in regards to registration, more specifics on those dates and times are linked on the slide there. Here we have our additional spring events. So we have a few trainings coming up around tier 2, around check-in, check-out, and then of course our Coffee Connects as well. So all of that information as well as topics are linked on the slide. Our next Coffee Connect is coming up on February 12th, around integrating and scheduling for SEBL. We do, of course, have our exit ticket as always. So if there are particular topics, resources that you guys are looking for, we would invite you to fill out the exit ticket. We're always looking for ideas around different topics that you guys are interested in, additional maybe resources or questions that you might have. You can also request a certificate of attendance if needed through that link as well. And then that brings us to our optimistic closure. So again, just kind of more of a personal reflection. You can certainly drop it in the chat if you would like. But in thinking about our Coffee Connect this morning, thinking about some of the pieces that we talked about around behavior, which floor are you stopping on this morning? So we have maybe an excited, an inspired, content, a bored, or a discouraged. So again, you can put whatever floor number maybe that you are feeling like you're stopping on this morning after really kind of thinking about some of those behavior pieces and digging into that function of behavior. We got a few in the chat. Thank you for participating. Love it. This comes from First Five. I think Sarah talked about it a little bit with our welcoming inclusion as well, but just a great resource for some of those reflections and for some of those activities. All right. Some inspired. So love it. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our Coffee Connect. If you guys have any questions or any need for additional resources, this is our contact information. We do also have our job posting for Region 3 SEBL Specialist. I think Mackenzie can maybe put that in the chat for us, but that would be serving ESUs 178. So I believe the application is still open. Thank you so much.